He was smiling. That was the first thing Steve noticed, and the thing that scared him most. In 30 years of watching Dominique's back, Steve had never once seen the man's jaw unclench at a table full of rivals. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was peace. And so Dominique sat at the head of that white linen throne, crystal glass rising toward his lips, tattoos folding beneath his cuffs, and he smiled. Steve saw her hands first, the way Catherine had tilted that carafe just slightly away from the others, the quiet switch, the careful return to her seat, a movement so small, so rehearsed that no one else in that room caught it. No one else knew what he knew. His legs moved before his mind gave the order. The glass shattered. Red wine spread across white linen like something had been wounded. And Dominique, the man who had survived 2 wars, 4 attempts on his life, and a decade of enemies who never got close enough, went completely, utterly still. He didn't look at the broken glass. He didn't look at Steve. He looked at Catherine. And in that silence, one question filled the room that no one dared ask aloud. How long had she been waiting to do this? Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the last frame of a story like this, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if someone sent you here, like this video so more people find it. Now, let's go back to that table. The invitations had gone out in sealed envelopes, hand-delivered, no return address. That was how Dominique operated. If you received one, you already knew what it meant. You came, or you sent your regrets along with an explanation detailed enough to satisfy a man who did not accept vague answers. Everyone came. The dining room of the Aldecoa estate had not hosted a gathering like this in over a decade. 14 chairs, 14 people who, on any other night of the year, would sooner burn the building down than share a cable. The chandelier above them threw warm gold light across faces that had ordered terrible things, and faces that had carried out those orders without blinking. Crystal caught the light. Silver gleamed. The room smelled of aged wood, roasted lamb, and the particular tension that fills any space where powerful people are pretending not to be afraid of each other. Dominique had chosen everything deliberately. The round table, so no one sat below anyone else. The open wine, no private bottles, no personal carafes brought in from outside. The staff, vetted 3 times over, faces he recognized. He had spent 2 weeks designing this dinner the way a general designs a battlefield, every variable considered, every exit mapped, every person in the room a known quantity. That was what he believed. He sat with the ease of a man who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority. He didn't raise his voice. He rarely gestured. When he spoke, the table contracted slightly toward him, an involuntary lean, like gravity. Lorenzo Motta, seated to his left, laughed too readily at everything Dominique said, the way men laugh when they are still deciding whether to be enemies. Across from him, Anthony Reyes kept his hands visible on the table at all times, an old habit from rooms where hidden hands got people killed. Sharon Vale, the only other woman besides Catherine at the table, watched everyone with the patient attention of someone who had survived this world not through strength, but through memory. She forgot nothing. Dominique respected that. He respected all of them in the way that you respect a thing capable of destroying you. But tonight he had allowed himself something rare. The treaty framework had been agreed upon in principle 3 days prior. Tonight was ratification through ritual, the ancient wordless contract of sharing a meal. If they ate together, they were bound together. That was older than law, older than money. Dominique understood that some agreements are made not in writing, but in the act of breaking bread with someone you once wished dead. He reached for his wine. The glass was full, deep red, the same bottle that had been poured for everyone. He had watched it poured. He had watched everything. That was what 30 years had made him, a man who watched. And yet he had not watched the one moment that mattered. He would think about that later, alone, in the kind of silence that follows a near thing. He would think about how comfort is the enemy of survival, how the one night he allowed himself to feel something close to relief was the one night someone at his own table had decided it would be his last. He would think about all of it later. Right now, the glass was at his lips, and Steve was already moving, crossing the room with the look of a man carrying a secret that had just become unbearable, and Dominique, for the first time in 30 years, was a half-second behind. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who was in that room. Catherine Lazarova sat at Dominique's right hand, where she had sat for 9 years. She was not beautiful in any soft sense of the word. She was precise, sharp jaw, dark eyes that catalogued everything, a stillness about her that people often mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was the particular composure of someone who has trained themselves over a very long time not to react. She had come up through the Eastern networks before Dominique brought her in, and she had made herself indispensable the way only truly intelligent people do, not by being the loudest voice, but by being the one who remembered what everyone else had already forgotten. Dominique trusted her the way he trusted his own hands, without thinking about it, without needing to. That is the most dangerous kind of trust. Across from her sat Suzanne Ardell, who handled Dominique's financial architecture with the detached precision of a woman who had never once lost sleep over where the money came from. She was elegant, reserved, and had a habit of folding her napkin into perfect thirds before every meal, a tic so reliable that Steve had once used it to time a room sweep. Next to her, Lorenzo Matta filled his chair like a man who needed to be seen filling it. He was loud in the measured way of someone who had learned that loudness projects safety. He laughed easily. He touched people's arms when he spoke. He had ordered 3 men killed in the past 18 months and attended all 3 funerals. Anthony Reyes said almost nothing, which was its own form of communication. He had been Dominique's most complicated alliance for 6 years, never fully inside, never fully out. His hand stayed on the table, his eyes stayed moving. Steve had flagged him 3 times in pre-dinner security reviews, and 3 times Dominique had said, "He's fine," and moved on. Lucia Verne arrived last, which was a deliberate choice, and brought with her a young aide whose name no one had caught clearly, a quiet woman who stood near the wall all evening, hands folded, face arranged into perfect neutrality. Staff, or not quite staff, the kind of presence that gets forgotten the moment you stop looking at her. Sharon Vale, Adam Corr, Kate Marin, each of them with histories long enough to fill rooms, each of them here because the alternative, being excluded from the piece, was more dangerous than attendance. They smiled, they made conversation, they passed bread and complimented the wine, and behaved exactly as people behave when they are performing normalcy for an audience of equals. And then there was Amanda, the house attendant, who had been clearing and resetting the far end of the table all evening with the invisible efficiency of someone who understood that their job was to not exist in the room's memory. She had refilled 3 glasses without being asked. She had removed a smudged fork and replaced it before its owner noticed. She moved like water, present everywhere, remarked upon nowhere. Steve had watched all of them. He had catalogued postures, tracked eye contact, noted who spoke to whom and who carefully avoided it. He had done this for 30 years, and he was very good at it. Which is why it took him until the third course to realize he had been watching the wrong person entirely. Steve's position in any room was always the same, never seated, never eating, 5 steps behind Dominique's right shoulder, close enough to move, far enough to see everything. It was a position he had chosen himself years ago, and held with the consistency of a man who understood that his value was not in being present, it was in being invisible while present. Guests stopped seeing him within the first 10 minutes. He became furniture. That was the point. The third course arrived. Conversation had loosened the way it does when wine has been working steadily and the initial performance of civility has begun to feel almost genuine. Lorenzo was telling a story that required both hands. Anthony had spoken twice, which was twice more than usual. Even Sharon Vale had allowed herself a dry half-smile at something Adam Corey said. The room had reached that fragile equilibrium where people forget, briefly, to be careful. Steve was watching the aide, Lucia's quiet shadow near the far wall, when his peripheral vision caught movement at the wrong end of the table. Not dramatic movement, not the kind that draws eyes, just Catherine rising from her chair with the unhurried ease of someone reaching for something they have every right to reach for. Her napkin stayed folded on her seat. Her expression didn't shift. She moved to the serving credenza along the side wall, the one holding the reserve bottles, the backup linens, the things that existed to service the table without interrupting it. Steve watched her. She lifted a carafe, not the one that had been pouring all evening, a different one, set slightly behind the others, unremarkable in the way that only deliberate placement makes something unremarkable. She carried it back toward the table. Her path took her briefly behind Dominique's chair, which was natural enough, a simple geometry of the room. And in that passing, in the span of 3 seconds that no one else was measuring, she set the full carafe beside Dominique's glass and lifted his glass and set it aside and poured from the new carafe and returned his glass to its exact position. Then she continued back to her seat, smoothed her dress, picked up her napkin, and rejoined the conversation about a property dispute in the Southern Territories, as though she had simply stretched her legs. Steve did not move. His training was precise about moments like this, about the space between seeing something and reacting to it, about the cost of moving too early or too late. He stayed still, and he ran it back in his mind, frame by frame, the way you replay something when your instincts are already certain, but your reason needs to catch up. She had not poured from the communal bottle. She had used a separate carafe. She had handled only Dominique's glass. She had done it in the window between the moment Lorenzo's story peaked and the moment the room's laughter subsided, the precise window when every set of eyes was pointed elsewhere. She had returned without hurry, without guilt, without any micro-expressions that betray improvisation. This was not improvised. Steve looked at Catherine, now leaning slightly toward Sharon, saying something gracious and measured, her dark eyes warm with the performance of ease. Then he looked at Dominique, who was nodding at something Lorenzo had said, who was relaxed, who was present in a way Steve had not seen in years, whose hand was already moving toward his glass. And Steve understood. Not suspected, not feared, but understood with the cold and absolute clarity of a man who knew exactly what Andrew Lazaroff's name meant, what he was looking at. He had 3 seconds, maybe 4.
He moved. No warning, no calculation, no consideration of what it would cost him to cross a room full of the most dangerous people on the continent and put his hands on something that belonged to their host. 30 years of protocol dissolved in a single step. Steve was already past Lorenzo's chair before the word had fully left his mouth. "Don't touch that glass." Not a shout, not yet. Something lower and more urgent, the kind of sound that cuts through noise precisely because it doesn't belong to it. Dominique heard it. His hand paused, a fraction, a single arrested motion, and in that fraction Steve closed the remaining distance and his palm came down hard on the crystal stem. The glass didn't fall cleanly. It caught the edge of the plate, spun and shattered against the table's rim. Red wine went wide across the white linen in a shape that looked, to everyone watching, like something catastrophic had already happened, which it had, just not the catastrophic thing they were imagining. The room detonated, not with sound, with the opposite of sound. 14 people who had spent their entire lives reading rooms for threats all read this one simultaneously, and the result was a single compressed second of absolute stillness, every body tensed, every hand moving toward instinct. 2 of Anthony's associates were on their feet before they knew why. Lorenzo's chair scraped back hard. Sharon Vale's hand disappeared beneath the table and came back empty, but the movement was enough to make the man beside her flinch sideways. Someone knocked a water glass. Someone else said something in a language Steve didn't recognize. And then Dominique stood up. That was all it took. One motion, unhurried from the head of the table, and the room's chaos hit a wall and stopped. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak. He simply rose to his full height and looked at the room, and 14 people who moments ago had been half out of their chairs settled back into them with the chastened instinct of those who understand on a cellular level who is in charge. Steve stood at Dominique's shoulder, breathing, the broken stem still on the tablecloth between them. He had not looked at Catherine since he moved. He was looking at Dominique. Dominique was looking at the wine soaking into the white linen, a long look, the look of a man reading something written in a language he hadn't expected to encounter tonight. Then he looked up, not at Steve, not at the room, at the glass that had been set aside, the original glass, the one Catherine had moved before pouring. It was still sitting on the credenza, untouched, exactly where she had left it. Dominique's gaze traveled from that glass, slowly, with the patience of someone who is in no hurry because they have already arrived at the answer, across the length of the table, to Catherine, who had not moved, who was sitting with her hands folded, her napkin in her lap, her expression composed in a way that required, Steve now understood, extraordinary effort. She did not look away. She met Dominique's eyes with the steadiness of someone who had already decided, long before tonight, that if this moment came, she would not flinch from it. The room held its breath. Dominique said nothing. He simply looked at her, and whatever passed between them in that silence was older and heavier than anything else in the room. Then he turned to Steve and said, very quietly, "Clear them out."
They left without argument. That, more than anything, told you what kind of room it had been. Lorenzo didn't finish his sentence. Anthony's associates didn't ask questions. Sharon Vale retrieved her coat from the back of her chair with the practiced composure of a woman who had excused herself from dangerous rooms before and understood that the speed of your exit was a form of respect. Adam Corr nodded once at Dominique, not farewell, something more like acknowledgement, and followed the others into the corridor, where Steve's secondary team was already waiting to escort them out through the east entrance, away from the street, away from windows, away from any later claim that they had witnessed something. The staff went too. Amanda, Lucia's unnamed aide, the 2 servers who had been stationed near the kitchen door. Steve moved them out with a word and a look, and they went with the quiet urgency of people who understood that whatever was happening in this room was not something they wanted to have seen. In under 4 minutes, the dining room held 2 people. Dominique had not sat back down. He stood at the head of his chair, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, and he watched Catherine the way you watch something you are still deciding how to classify. Not with rage. Rage would have been easier. Rage was loud and consumable, and it burned itself out. This was something else. This was the expression of a man sorting through 9 years of memory and finding, in each one, a new and different shape than the one he had assigned it at the time. Catherine did not fill the silence. She had the discipline, or perhaps the grief, not to reach for explanation before he was ready to receive it. She sat with the stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment and found, now that it had arrived, that rehearsal had not prepared her for the specific weight of his eyes. The candles had burned lower. The broken glass was still on the tablecloth. Neither of them looked at it. When Dominique finally spoke, his voice was level in a way that required visible control. You could hear the effort of it, the deliberate absence of everything he was not yet ready to release. He said, "How long?" Catherine's jaw tightened, a small movement, barely perceptible. But in 9 years, Steve had learned to read her in millimeters, and from his position at the door, he saw it clearly, the single fissure in the composure she had held all evening. 3 months, she said. The number landed in the room and didn't leave. 3 months. Which meant she had sat at Dominique's right hand for 3 months, had attended 7 meetings, had reviewed contracts, had offered counsel, had eaten at this table twice before, and had been carrying this with her through all of it. 3 months of waiting, 3 months of deciding, 3 months of watching the man across from her now and saying nothing. Dominique absorbed this without expression. Then he said, "Whose idea was the carafe?" And Catherine looked at him for a long moment with something that might, in different circumstances, have been mistaken for admiration, for the precision of the question, for the fact that even now, even here, he was still thinking like the man she had served for 9 years. "Mine," she said. "All of it was mine." Dominique nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already known, and asked only to hear her say it. "Then you'd better tell me why. And Catherine," he paused, "tell me the truth. You've earned that much." We're pausing here for one reason only, because if this story is doing what it's supposed to do, you're not comfortable right now. Share it with someone who needs to feel that too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The second half of this story is where everything you think you know stops being true. She didn't answer him, not directly, not yet. What she did was reach into the inside pocket of her jacket and set something on the table, a photograph. Small, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of image that has been handled too many times in private moments to remain crisp. She slid it across the white linen toward Dominique and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Dominique looked at it without touching it. A young man, early 20s, dark eyes, Catherine's jaw, a smile that had no knowledge yet of the world it was living in. "His name," Catherine said, "is Andrew." The room didn't change. The candles didn't flicker. Steve, at the door, felt something move through him that had no clean name, a cold recognition, the particular nausea of a thing you have tried not to think about, arriving anyway, fully formed, in a room you cannot leave. Dominique's eyes stayed on the photograph. "He worked in the Meridian accounts," Catherine continued. Her voice had changed, not broken, but stripped of its architecture, the professional precision gone, something raw underneath. He made an error, a significant one. He was 23, and he made an error, and someone flagged it, and the order came down through the usual channels. She paused. He never knew it was coming. I didn't know until it was already done. Silence. "He's my son," she said, as though Dominique might not have understood, as though the photograph and the name and the 9 years sitting at his right hand hadn't already made it plain. "He has been my son since before I knew your name." Dominique said nothing. He was still looking at the photograph with that same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, as though the image might yield more information if he gave it enough time. Steve stepped forward from the door. He had not planned to speak, but the weight of 3 months was heavier than the weight of protocol, and Catherine had just told half the truth, and the half she didn't know was the half that belonged to him. "The flag came from me," he said. Both of them looked at him. Dominique's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration, rapid and invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "The meridian discrepancy," Steve said. "I reviewed the accounts in November. The name attached to the irregularity was Andrew Lazarev. I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know who he was. I ran the name through standard process. I flagged it. The order was generated automatically, and I signed off on it before I understood what I'd put in motion." He looked at Catherine. "By the time I made the connection, it had already gone to execution." Catherine stared at him. Something was moving across her face that Steve couldn't look at directly. "You knew," she said. "Not an accusation yet, something before an accusation. Tonight, when you saw me with the glass, you already knew." "Yes," Steve said. The word sat between the three of them like a fourth person in the room. Dominique finally moved. He picked up the photograph from the tablecloth, looked at it for one long moment, then set it down facing Catherine. He looked at Steve with an expression that contained everything and revealed nothing. And then he asked the question that made the floor feel unsteady beneath them both. "How long have you known it was her son?"
Steve told him. All of it. The date he made the connection, the hours he spent confirming it, the 3 months of carrying it in silence like a stone he couldn't set down. He spoke without defense or self-pity, because Dominique had no patience for either, and because the truth was already in the room, and dressing it in anything softer would have been an insult to everyone present. When he finished, Dominique looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Wait outside." Steve left. He closed the door behind him and stood in the corridor and listened to the silence of a room in which 2 people were about to say things that could not be unsaid. He never heard raised voices. That was the thing he would remember most. Inside, Dominique moved to the chair beside Catherine, not across from her, beside her, and sat down. The gesture was so contrary to what she had been bracing for that it briefly undid her composure in a way that his anger never could have. She had prepared herself for cold fury, for the particular violence of a powerful man reminded of his own vulnerability. She had not prepared herself for him to simply sit down next to her like a person. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the photograph on the table between them, and she looked at it too, and for a moment they were just 2 people looking at a young man who was no longer alive. Then Dominique said, "Why didn't you come to me?" 4 words, quiet enough that they barely disturbed the air. Catherine opened her mouth and found, to her own surprise, that nothing was there. She had anticipated this question in the abstract, had turned it over in the sleepless hours of the past 3 months, and constructed a dozen answers, each one reasonable, each one honest in its own partial way. But sitting here, with him beside her, and Andrew's face between them, every answer she had prepared revealed itself as what it actually was, an explanation for something that had no satisfying explanation. She had not come to him because she had not believed it would work, because 9 years of watching how his world operated had taught her that the machinery of it did not pause for personal appeals, that the order would have been reviewed and upheld, that to ask would have been to expose Andrew to closer scrutiny rather than less. She had not come to him because she was afraid, and because she was proud, and because somewhere in the unbearable arithmetic of the past 3 months she had decided that if the world he built had taken her son, then the least she could do was take him back from it. She knew, sitting here now, that she might have been wrong, that there might have been another way, that the same intelligence she had brought to 9 years of serving him faithfully she had failed to bring to the one moment that mattered most, and had reached instead for the only instrument that felt certain, that felt like control in a situation where she had none. She could not say any of this, because to say it was to admit that Andrew had died for a decision she made in grief rather than reason, that his death might have been preventable, that she had chosen poison over words because words required hope, and she had run out of it. "I don't know," she said finally, and it was the most honest thing she had ever told him. Dominique was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, so softly it almost wasn't a question, "Did you think I wouldn't have listened?" And Catherine's composure, which had held through the dinner and the shattered glass and Steve's confession and all the machinery of this terrible evening, came apart in her chest without making a single sound.
Dominique stood, not abruptly. He rose the way he did everything, with the measured deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago that stillness was power and haste was a form of confession. He crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the room, the one that had always been there, that guests assumed was decorative. He opened the lower drawer and removed a folder, thin, manila, the kind that held single documents rather than histories. He didn't open it immediately. He stood with it in his hand and looked at the window, at the dark glass, at the city below reduced to amber points of light, and he was quiet for long enough that Catherine watched him with the cautious attention of someone who no longer trusted their ability to predict what came next. Then he opened the folder and looked at what was inside. Steve would later piece together what it contained from the fragments Dominique shared in the car ride home, a reversal order generated 6 weeks prior when Dominique had been reviewing a separate account irregularity and had traced it back through the meridian chain and found, buried in the automated flagging sequence, a name attached to a financial error so minor that it should never have generated a terminal outcome. He had pulled the file, he had read it, and he had written in his own hand across the execution order already processed, "Confirm status before any action. Hold pending my review." The confirmation had come back in 4 days. Andrew Lazarev had died on a Tuesday in January, 6 days before Dominique's reversal order reached the desk it needed to reach. 6 days. The machinery of the world he had built had moved faster than the hand he had extended to stop it. He had known this for 5 weeks. He had carried it the same way Steve had carried his piece, in silence,
looking for a seam in it, finding none. Dominique looked at the document for a moment longer. Then he folded it, once, twice, and tore it cleanly in half, then in half again. He set the pieces on the desk in a small pile, and he did not look at them again. Catherine had watched all of this without speaking. She had not recognized the folder. She had no way of knowing what it held or what the tearing meant. From where she sat, it looked like a man destroying evidence, which in her world was a practical and familiar act, and she assigned it no particular weight. That was the thing that would stay with Steve longest in all the months that followed. Not the dinner, not the glass, not even the confession in the car. It was this: Catherine never knew. Dominique did not tell her. He tore up the document that proved he had tried to save her son, that proved in the most unbearable terms that she had poisoned him for nothing, and he put the pieces in his pocket, and he returned to the table, and he sat back down beside her, and he said nothing. Steve, called back into the room 10 minutes later, understood immediately from the set of Dominique's jaw and the particular blankness behind his eyes that something had shifted, something had been decided. He didn't know what the folder had contained, but he knew what it meant when Dominique tore something up instead of burning it. It meant he intended to carry what was written on it himself. Some truths, Dominique had once told him, do more damage given than kept. Steve had not understood that fully until now. Catherine sat across from them both, hollowed out and still, believing the worst thing that had happened tonight was that she had failed. Not knowing that the worst thing, the thing that would have broken her entirely, was written in pieces in the pocket of the man who had just decided, for reasons she would never be given, to protect her from it. The car pulled away from the estate at 11:43. No escort. Dominique had waved off the secondary vehicles with a single gesture, which Steve had noted and not questioned. The city moved past the windows in slow amber intervals, street lights, storefronts, the occasional lit window of someone living a life that had nothing to do with any of this. Dominique sat behind him in the dark of the rear cabin and said nothing. Steve drove. He knew the route home the way he knew everything connected to Dominique, completely, without needing to think about it. His hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was even. Every external indicator suggested a man in control of himself, which was the indicator Steve had spent 30 years perfecting, regardless of what was happening underneath it. They were 12 minutes from the estate when he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. "The rest of it." Dominique in the rearview mirror didn't move, a dark shape against darker leather. His face was mostly shadow, one edge of it caught by a passing light, enough to see that his eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance. "I know what you told me in there," Steve said, "about flagging the name, about the timeline." He paused. That was true, but it wasn't complete. He kept his eyes on the road. "I knew who Andrew Lazarev was before I flagged it, not who he was to Catherine. I didn't know that until later. But I knew he was young, and I knew the discrepancy was minor, and I knew that a flag from me would move it to a level of review where it would almost certainly generate a terminal outcome." He stopped, steadied himself. "I flagged it anyway. I told myself it was process, that I was doing my job. But there was a faction problem in the Meridian accounts that quarter, you remember, and I was under pressure to demonstrate that the financial irregularities were being addressed seriously. Andrew's name was the only concrete irregularity I could point to. I used it." The city moved past. "I didn't kill him," Steve said, "but I made him available to be killed, and I have known that since January, and I sat in that room tonight watching Catherine carry something I helped put in motion, and I said nothing until I had no other choice." He said it all to the windshield, to the road, to the city that kept moving with complete indifference to any of it. I'm not telling you this because I want something from you, not forgiveness, not a decision tonight. I'm telling you because you made a decision in that room to carry something alone, and I watched you do it, and I can't let you carry the weight of this one without knowing what it's actually made of. He said nothing else. There was nothing else. The confession had a shape, and he had given it completely, and whatever came next belonged to the man in the back seat. The car moved through the last stretch of city before the private roads began. A long, straight corridor of dark trees on either side, the kind of road that feels at night like a passage between one state of things and another. Steve watched the mirror. Dominique had not moved, had not spoken. His right hand rested on the console beside him, the small panel that controlled the privacy screen. The dark glass partition that, once raised, turned the rear cabin into a sealed and separate world. His index finger rested against the edge of it, not pressing, not lifting away, resting. The trees moved past, the road continued, and Steve drove on into the dark, not knowing and understanding for the first time in his life that not knowing was the only just outcome available to him. He had said what he said, the rest was not his to decide. The index finger didn't move, the screen stayed down, the road kept going. The screen stayed down, the road kept going. And we'll leave it exactly there, because some endings are meant to live in you, not on the screen. If this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and subscribe. We make these for the people who don't look away. Come back tomorrow. There's more.